Welcome to The Business. I'm Lanre Akinola. On this show, we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. Business affects every one of us, whoever we are, wherever we are. In the news this week, Ethiopia plans to sell a 30 to 40% stake in its state-run telecoms monopoly and split the company in two in order to spur competition. Mauritius offers foreigner citizenship in exchange for a $1 million contribution to its National Sovereign Wealth Fund. This week's big story: after months of delay, President BUHARI finally signs Nigeria's 2018 budget into law. And in this week's breakdown, we'll be looking at how African countries fare in the 2018 World Wealth Report. Joining me throughout for commentary and insight is Vuyiswa Ngobongwana, broadcaster and Africa watcher. And in part two, I'll be talking to Werner Ayukegba, principal Africa analyst at IHS Markit. The Ethiopian government has announced that it will sell a substantial stake in its state-run telecoms monopoly and split the company in two. The purpose is to spur on competition. Vuyiswa, this has been one of the big stories in Africa for the last couple of weeks. The entire telecoms industry has been waiting for Ethiopia to open up its telecom sector. It's got a 100 million strong population. It's the last frontier for the mobile industry on the continent, which has been one of the big success stories since the turn of the century. They're finally opening up the market. It's good news both in terms of what happens in telecoms, but it's also reflective of more reform in the Ethiopian economy. Your thoughts on this?
Absolutely, very much motivated by, the twin pillars of the need to have a healthy economic environment that's competitive, because competition stimulates growth. They know that on a basic level. And the other pillar being maintaining control over the communications industry, because that is where protest movements garner force and attention. And that dictatorial government, because there is no other way of describing it, has been very reluctant to let go of that arena. So I, as an Africa watcher, will be interested to see how much censorship there might be around people being able to express themselves more freely. But for Ethiopia as an entity, it's progress.
It's certainly a big shift, and that the refusal to open the sector previously has been seen, or was for a long time seen, as part of that sort of state-led development mentality, anti-business, and inherently suspicious of their own people. So it's got to be encouraging.
But also they're inherently suspicious of Western economic entities who are there to make a profit. Let's not romanticize this. This isn't about helping Ethiopia. It's getting in early on a burgeoning market.
So just on that note, the biggest telecoms company in Africa is an African company. South Africa's MTN. Second biggest is an Indian company. So it's not just the Westerners who are making money
here. Yeah, but who runs MTN?
South Africans.
That's the
do.
question. Okay.
Anyway, we'll have to move on from this story. Interesting times for telecoms in Ethiopia. Mauritius is offering foreigners the opportunity to obtain citizenship in exchange for a $1 million donation to the country's sovereign wealth fund. Family members can also obtain citizenship for an extra $100,000 each. So it's been a tight couple of years for African governments. A lot of budgets across the continent are stretched. Is this a novel approach to raising public revenue?
Certainly
it's certainly an unusual step.
Very, very unusual. And from my perspective, it's like, desperate measures for desperate times. And it's logical. I mean, you would look at all your resources as a country, and you sort of think, well, what can we do that will create an attractive environment for investors? And low tax rates are a major factor.
Yeah, Mauritius it likes to brand itself as a conduit for investment, but this does suggest that there's a little bit more to it. It's a good place for rich people to keep their money, but
Yeah.
is it potentially a model that other African countries could emulate who are looking to raise a bit more money? Why not take advantage of wealthy people who are willing to put down $1 million in exchange for a passport?
Well, they may emulate that, and I wouldn't be surprised. There'll be a lot of people watching very closely how events develop within Mauritius. But until these African governments that are looking for what, to me, feels like a short-term, desperate measure, solution, until they actually start addressing the social causes for discontent in their country and putting in the level of information sharing and education of their own populace, all that this will do is bring in another layer of rich people who will keep spreading the differential between those that have and those that don't.
Thank you, Vias. Well, if you've got $1 million and like Mauritius, you might want to have a look at this one. This week's big story is Nigeria's budget, which has finally been signed into law. Can it help boost the economy ahead of elections in February? Well, it's been a long time coming, but President Buhari has at long last signed the 2018 budget into law, only 6 months after it was supposed to have been signed in the first place. Now, it's a record budget for Nigeria, $25 billion. It's a 20% increase on last year. What is the significance of the budget being passed? What can we expect by way of impact? How's this money going to be spent? Is it good news for the Nigerian economy?
The more interesting question for me is the reasons for the delay, because that's the underlying agenda that's still bubbling away regardless of what's done between now and the election. I'm not sure it's good for the economy, but it certainly creates a veneer of confidence, at least. People know where they stand, because any economic environment is very much influenced by how it feels. Do people feel secure? No. The government's not secure. Why would I put money in there? So it's very much a psychological battle. So Buhari has done the right thing, even though delayed, in creating potential confidence for investors who are looking to Nigeria long term.
This isn't just about investors. This is about how the country invests in its own assets and its own development needs. And no one will argue that Nigeria needs more by way of public expenditure, whether it's to address basic issues like infrastructure, healthcare, education. The key question as always is this money actually going to be used in the right way? And you said earlier, what's behind the delay? We all know there's an election coming up. That will invariably have an impact on how these funds are managed. What would you imagine?
I just had a very interesting thought that wouldn't it be nice to have an African government appeal to the billionaires within their country and say, could you invest in us and our development, and we'll make a big thing about it in the news, so you get so much more business and kudos coming to you. Now that would have been an interesting thing for Buhari to do with the, how many thousands of millionaires are there in Nigeria? 128,000 or something?
No, that's across Africa.
That's across Africa.
167,000.
Oh, is that all? You see, but if those people were Africa focused and loving their motherland like they will say in public, then they would literally put their money where their mouth is.
We'll have to wait and see if Nigeria puts its money where its mouth is. Every year, a Paris-based global consulting firm, Capgemini, published their World Wealth Report. The 2018 edition has just been launched. What does it tell us about private wealth in Africa? Well, I don't know how you feel about wealth rankings and rich lists. The world is full of them. This is an interesting one. It tells us that the old cliche that the rich just keep getting richer is actually true.
Such a depressing.
Private wealth for high net worth individuals has exceeded 70 trillion, and I didn't say that wrong, trillion dollars for the first time. The top 1% have been the biggest earners. Africa is still a fairly small part of this story. There's about 167,000 high net worth individuals in Africa, about 0.5% of this huge amount of money that's sitting there in private hands. What's your reaction to this?
It makes me depressed when I see this, because what it does is rubber stamp in the collective consciousness this pyramid idea that capitalism thrives on, that the rich will keep getting richer and the poor just have to stay where they are. Now, who benefits from seeing these figures? What is the point of creating these rich listing unless, from the perspective of an African who wants some change, more equitable distribution of wealth, you utilize these figures as a way of targeting those individuals and saying, what are you doing to help our motherland? Well, that's what I'm interested in.
I guess it depends on the conclusions you draw, and one of the conclusions is an issue that's long been understood across Africa, which is the need for more inclusive growth. that yes, you can have GDP growth, but what does it matter if the money flows into a small amount of hands? Perhaps this can serve as a reminder for the need for policies that are aimed at actually driving structural reform. Do you see anyone responding positively in that respect? Do you see any evidence that across Africa, governments are taking this need for more inclusive growth seriously?
I think they're being forced to because of pressure of the system that they're working in being so pathetically inefficient, even for them. Now, when the people making profit find it's not as profitable as it used to, that's their stimulus for change. Not so much concern about those below them on the pyramid. So I see no other examples on the African continent that are motivated by the positive inclination of wanting to assist the greater majority. It would be more a reaction to keep the gravy train flowing, in essence, and that's what's going on.
Thank you, Viezwa. You heard it here. The rich do indeed keep getting richer. Join me in part 2 when I'll be talking to Verna Ayukegba, Principal Africa Analyst at IHS Markit. Welcome back to The Business, the show where we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. I'm Lanre Kinol, and I'm delighted to be joined by Verna Ayukegba, Principal Africa Analyst at IHS Markit. Verna, thank you very much for joining me on The Business today.
Thank you for having me, Lanre.
2018 is turning out to be quite an exciting year for a number of countries across Africa. Change is a really strong theme from East Africa to Southern Africa. We've seen it in Zimbabwe, we've seen it in South Africa, we're seeing it in Angola. But I think one country really stands out, and that's the country we're going to be talking about today, which is Ethiopia. The former Prime Minister, Haile Mariam Desalegn, he stepped down in January. There's been a new Prime Minister in place since April, and he is overseeing sweeping changes across Ethiopia, economically and politically. Let's start with the economy. It's been a long time coming. Investors have been waiting for this for years. Ethiopia has announced that it's finally going to start liberalizing its economy in a meaningful way. They're opening up state-owned enterprises, including the telecom sector. Talk us through a little bit of the significance of this.
Now, this is extremely huge for Ethiopia, particularly because Ethiopia has often had a closed hand around its economy in that sense and not literally let a lot of foreign investors to come in. Telecoms, for example, Ethiopia has a population of over 100 million people. Now that is a huge market for telecoms. And we have seen in the past regional companies like MTN or like Safaricom try to move into Ethiopia, but then the Ethiopian government has always been very reluctant to accept this. And so opening up Ethiopia's telecom sector is a huge opportunity for these companies to be able to tap into this market. It's also a good opportunity for Ethiopia to be able to attract better technology and better services into its market.
It feels like the country is moving into the next phase of its development story. It's been the fastest growing economy in Africa since the turn of the century. It's the fastest growing economy again this year, almost 9%. I think it's 8.5%. Why is this shift happening now? Is it just external pressure here? Because we know that Abiy Ahmed, the new prime minister, has come in on the back of mass protests for years and years. Is that what's really led to this big step here?
The new prime minister certainly seems like a gentleman who is in a rush to achieve a lot of things. But yes, you're right. The protests, which we saw, the Oromo protests as they're called, which have been going on since 2014, I think, have actually showed the limits of the previous government and the current system, or the previous system, I would say, given that there's a new prime minister with a new system, in terms of using a very centralized government in that sense to be able to control everything and for the government to be everywhere and to be able to take care of everything. So the limits of those that system has been shown, and now the government is responding and reacting and trying to say, okay, we think we need to liberalize here and getting capital and expertise from outside to come, of course, in a staged manner in that sense, to be able to allow them not lose control significantly.
That phased approach is very reminiscent of China.
Yes.
And Ethiopia has for many years been quite clear that they favor that kind of approach. Yes. Are we, we've talked a lot about economic transformation in Africa. No country has really pulled it off. Are we looking at perhaps the one country here that might be able to emulate some of the huge success stories we've seen in Asia?
I would hope so, but they still have a tall hill to climb. If you look at Ethiopia demographically, they are extremely poor regions in that sense. And so even though we see the boom story around Addis Ababa and the infrastructure which is going on there, I think they do still have quite a journey to go in that.
It's a long road ahead, but they shouldn't struggle to attract foreign capital. It's all about how this is used to drive meaningful economic development, surely.
That's true. They certainly shouldn't struggle. And if you see, we at IHS Market are still forecasting something like 9% growth next year. I do personally think that there's a lot more in the tank in terms of growth for Ethiopia. But then the reality here is that being able to have a total change in the way the economy is run, and by having state enterprises release their control, is going to be a tough challenge and a tough sell for the economy overall, and for people to be able to see these benefits to spread in a way that people expect. So I really do hope, but would have to wait and see on that one.
Well, look, the other side of the story here is, of course, the politics. And while Ethiopia has been, as I said earlier, the fastest growing economy in Africa for some time, one of the huge question marks has always been around political reconciliation. Yes. You have the majority of the country, from an ethnic standpoint, is politically marginalized, has been for a very long time, which has been the main source of the protests. There too, we're seeing big changes. The ODF, the Oromo Democratic Front, which is an exiled opposition group, has been invited back into Addis, which would have been almost unthinkable even 12 months ago. And that is aimed at overcoming that, which one is hugely significant in terms of the economic growth, but again, evidence that this government has decided we need to move forward.
Absolutely. I think we need to give huge credit to the previous Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn for acknowledging that the system which he was running had gotten to its limits, and he was not the face of change which was needed to push it ahead. So it's already a significant change for the new Prime Minister, who comes also from the Oromo region, to be the one who is in charge. Also, with respect to his background in terms of his age in that sense, and not having been a major player in the revolutionary fight, to be the one who's moving the country forward. Would have to see what the talks bring, but he has a balancing game to play also, because we have entrenched political forces in the TPLF, which still dominates the ruling coalition. So the Prime Minister has a balancing act to be able to, on the one hand, make sure he brings back a lot of the Oromo dissidents into the fold, but at the same time keeping the TPLF on board.
And maybe that's the biggest risk here, is change is always scary, and someone somewhere loses when change occurs. Yes. The power dynamics are clearly complex in Ethiopia, but how worrying is that? Because some groups will undoubtedly have benefited from the status quo for many years. Yeah. Now you've got all this radical upheaval. Is there a chance that the process could be frustrated and maybe even stopped? I mean, how secure is Ahmed in his position?
Well, to be honest, the power dynamics, in as much as the army establishment closely linked to the TPLF, one has to be honest, is probably seeing some of its power eroded. Recently, heads of securities were changed in that sense, and this is not something which we've seen in as much as it's happening and unfolding. And so certainly one of the risks is some kind of a counter push to be able to arrest this. That's all I could say.
And the momentum just feels overwhelming. I mean, for years, as you said earlier, the previous government basically tried to just crack down on protests. And it feels like the country is just behind this now. This is not just about the people in power. This is also just about the population.
Yes, certainly so. And this is something which we've also seen in other places in Africa, where you have a youthful population which has said enough is enough, and we want to move beyond what has been happening in the past days. And so guess what? You have a youthful population which is on social media, which is very often very urban in that sense, which is pushing this and is demanding more in terms of services.
How big is this as a regional story, as an African story? Clearly, these are times of great change for Ethiopians, but this is also really important for East Africa and for Africa as a whole. 100 million population, it should be and will in the next few years become the biggest market in East Africa and potentially could rival Nigeria as the leading market on the continent.
It is an extremely huge story. If I was an investor, I'd be putting my dollars, my euros, or my pounds into Ethiopia. I think it's a great potential, big economy. The population dynamics are great. And also with respect to the person who we have in as Prime Minister now. I earlier said he looked like a Prime Minister who was in a hurry. We have seen him now arrange a meeting between Salva Kiir Mayardit, the current president of South Sudan, and Riek Machar, who was the previous vice president. This is a meeting, we haven't seen a meeting like that for the past 2 years. And so there is movement in that sense in the region.
And this is something that many people might not appreciate, but Addis has always, from a political standpoint, been a very important hub for Pan-African issues, but also even international issues. It houses the African Union. All sorts of international activity takes place in Addis. Do you see that ramping up as you see this change sweeping through Ethiopia?
It is extremely important, and if at all we see the Ethiopian Prime Minister's recent travels and to Somalia.
We're almost out of time, so final point on this one.
Yes, if at all we see the Prime Minister's utterances in the press, his visits to Somalia in that sense, it shows that he's taken a proactive approach to make sure that he pushes an African agenda. And so certainly...
It's like he understands that Ethiopia has a responsibility beyond its own borders.
And he looks like somebody who's in a hurry to make it happen.
All right, Werner, thank you. We have really regrettably run out of time. I'd love to talk more about Ethiopia. I think it is the dark horse of African development. But thank you so much for being on The Business today.
Thank you for having me.
That's all we have time for. Thank you for watching The Business, and please join us again next time.